just read to you briefly today from Nehemiah. So I was thinking about, what we can pray when we're thinking about revival. And I thought it'd be good to go for a prayer from what really is a revival, isn't it? The revival of God's people. And really the question in Nehemiah chapter 1 is, what do you pray when the state of God's people makes you weep? Because that was the way it was for Nehemiah. Okay. So the people in exile, they are, their walls are down, they're in disgrace. And Nehemiah in chapter 1, verse 4 is weeping. He says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So he's weeping, and maybe some of us are doing that as well. We're weeping for the state of our nation. We're weeping for the cause of the gospel. The church isn't as it should be. So what do we pray? Well, surely what Nehemiah goes to straight away is he prays for the state of Jerusalem as it is right now. That's not what he does. He starts off, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. He first of all starts with God. He starts with two aspects really of God's character, his power, his ability to change things, and also with his love, with his covenant, with his people. If he doesn't have that in mind, then what's he praying for? He has a relationship with this God, and that's what draws him to prayer. So when we pray, when we're weeping over our nation, we should first of all start with remembering who God is, with praising him for being a God of power and love, and reminding ourselves who he is as we come to pray. Well, then surely he starts praying about the wars in Jerusalem, right? Well, no, again, verses 6 to 7. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. So he goes on to confess. And one of the great things here is that he both confesses the sin of everyone of the people of Israel and he and his father's family. Most people do one of two. They either focus on themselves and their personal sins and not thinking of themselves as part of the collective, or they'll talk about the sins of all those Christians who aren't like me. But Nehemiah confesses his sin, recognizes that he's a part of the problem, that Israel are part of the problem, and they've fallen. And actually, if you look at the history of revivals, I read a great book called Korean Pentecost, which is about one of the revivals in Korea. And one of the big features of that was people confessing their sin. That's what we've got to do if we're going to be revived. If we're going to come back to God, we've got to recognize that we're not there. And then finally, he gets around to praying what he's come for. But notice the way that he does this. He does this by relying on the promises that God has already given. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king, and I guess most of you know where this goes. But notice he prays the promises there, and he's praying for God's glory. You know, there can be a lot of mixed motives, particularly for those of us who work for churches. We can want the kingdom to grow because we want to have the success. But actually, Nehemiah all the way through is focused on God's glory. He focuses on who God's is. He focuses on how he and God's people have fallen short of that glory. And then what he plays is based on God's promises for God's glory. And I hope that as we think about that prayer and as we come to pray now, those things would shape our prayers as well. And if we do that, then maybe we'll see the kind of amazing revival that Nehemiah saw as Jerusalem was rebuilt. That's it from me.
Hey, thank you.